Welcome, guys, to our final masterclass for this term. You'll notice that it's called Essay Writing Part 1. Essay Writing Part 2, I'll record that video as well, and that will be available for students that sign up for Summit next term when you guys begin Year 12. Um, for new students, we'll cover the basic admin stuff. I'm Jason. I'll be a tutor for Summit next term, doing English Advanced. I graduated last year from Sydney Grammar with 99.9 ATAR and also 3 state ranks. And currently I'm all the way in the US right now in New York. And I'll be heading to Philadelphia tomorrow, where I'll be starting uni at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'll most likely be studying politics, philosophy, and economics. Um, Quickly about Summit. We offer tailored online group classes with 4 to 6 students beginning next term. And our class is are going to be for year 12. So we're going to be covering mathematics extension 1 and 2, English advanced, chemistry, and physics. All of our tutors have either achieved perfect ATAR, which is 99.95, or state rank. So very, very qualified and experienced in what they're doing. Along with that, you'll get access to a variety of resources and other support. So that's things like unlimited free essay marking. You'll get access to state ranking notes and exemplars, um, curated practice questions, mock exams, recorded lectures similar to this one as well. So that's a bit about Summit. Before we get into the lecture as well, just basic housekeeping, similar, as usual. I'd like for this to be as interactive as possible. Hopefully you guys will ask and answer questions as we go along. So feel free to just type in chat if you have questions or you want to answer one, or raise your hand and then I can unmute you so you guys can just shout out. As usual, we'll be recording our lecture. We'll be recording this lecture and we'll actually, yeah, okay, it's recording. Yeah, we'll upload this lecture to YouTube later. And now that I'm actually finally out of China, I can actually upload the slides at the end of this lecture. So I'll be doing that as well. And also I'll be staying back if anybody has any further questions. Okay. And kind of structure for today, pretty simple. We're going to be covering introductions, thesis statements, kind of topic sentences, that sort of thing. And I'll save sort of the analysis and body paragraph stuff for part 2 of the lecture. Okay, let's get into it then. Let's quickly talk about structure before we begin rest of the stuff. So I think structure is really, really simple. So if you have one text for HSC and for year 11, obviously we start with an introduction, then we move on to BP1, BP2, BP3, and then conclusion. What I wanted to discuss a bit more was kind of what we do when we have 2 texts. Because that's what, like, a lot of you guys will be facing definitely next year when you start year 12, but I know some of you guys are facing that in year 11 as well. The kind of approach for two texts usually is, you kind of break your essay into 2 key themes. And then, you'll have theme 1, and under theme 1, you'll do 2 paragraphs. So 1 paragraph on text 1, 1 paragraph on text 2. And then you'll delve into your second theme, and then you'll have 1 paragraph on theme 2, 1 paragraph on another paragraph on theme 2. I do want to introduce a caveat here though for kind of the 2 text ones. This is, by no means a hard and fast rule, right? So I think this advice on how to structure an essay when you have 2 texts is more applicable to the year 12s in this lecture, especially to module A, which you guys know is textual conversations. Because those texts tend to contrast a lot. So when you split it into 2 themes, kind of 4 paragraphs is the way to go. For a lot of you guys in year 11, prepping for your prelims, and I know a lot of you guys, are grammar students as well, a 3-paragraph structure works as well. The reason for 2 texts, the reason I'd say that is because, if you look at, for example, texts like Heart of Darkness versus Apocalypse Now, Conrad and Coppola actually do a lot of the same things, and they argue a lot of the same things when it comes to themes such as, power and corruption and, humanity's inner darkness, those sorts of things. So in that case where your texts have a lot of overlap and kind of thematic similarities, in that case, it's also fine to do a 3-paragraph structure. So paragraphs 1 and 2 might be about how they contrast, and then your final paragraph, paragraph 3, might be on what's the same and what's universal. So that's also a way to approach it. So don't feel as if you're sort of restricted into this sort of, 4-paragraph structure. 3 paragraphs works as well. But I think it's equally compelling as well. For example, if you're doing Coppola and Conrad, paragraphs 1 and 2 on their contrast, paragraphs 3 and 4, splitting that third paragraph into 2 paragraphs works as well. So it's written kind of really up to you guys. There's no sort of right or wrong answer. Right or wrong answer here. Many ways you guys can go about this. Okay, let's talk about introductions. And I kind of really want to focus on introductions today because I think I think introductions are sort of the most important part of your essay. I think it's the most important kind of for a few reasons. The first is very cynical, right? It's, HSC markers don't spend a lot of time in your essays. They're paid on, they're not paid kind of hourly. They're paid on how many essays they actually mark, right? So it's in their incentive to actually get through the essays as quick as possible. And that means sort of they judge you based on first impressions, and you really only have one chance to make a first impression. So it's really important to start off strong. And in many cases, you're just judged basically on your introduction, right? So the moment they finish reading your introduction, they already have kind of a mark range in your mind of where you're going to be. So it's really important for us kind of focus on introductions and make sure those are clean. And I also think I want to focus on that because that's where I think a lot of emphasis is lost in high school studies. You guys focus a lot on, body paragraphs, how you analyze quotes, techniques, how you do all that analysis, but less so on introductions and how we package and make arguments. There are a few features of kind of a great introduction, a great thesis. And I'm sure you guys have heard all of these before, but useful to recap. First is it obviously has to clearly answer the question and establish your argument. Second thing is that it has to integrate keywords from the question. But more than integrating keywords, it also has to unpack the keywords of the question. So we'll get into how we do this later. And on kind of moving into year 12, as you guys transition into next year as well, also really important to integrate rubric terms in your module. So for the year 12s in this lecture, if you're looking at texts like 1984 or Common Mod, rubric terms such as human experiences, anomalies, individual versus collective, those sorts of terms need to be in your introduction. The second thing an introduction has to do, it has to very clearly articulate the structure and direction of your essay. So it's kind of like signposting, right? So, it has to give your marker a very clear idea of where your 3 or your 4 body paragraphs are going to go. And that's really useful. A few things to stand out even more, which we'll cover a bit later as well in this lecture, is firstly, I think integration of the composer's context and intent is super, super important in making your sort of introduction stand out a bit more. And secondly, if you can, incorporation of literary theory, although I think this is more of a kind of more advanced skill and not completely necessary. And you'll see at the end point of all this that, this introduction needs quite a lot of things, right? There's a lot of moving parts in this introduction. So I think it's really important to note, kind of let you guys know that you shouldn't be afraid of long introductions, right? So I think a lot of students will will be writing the introduction, they'll get into kind of they'll get into the second page and be like, this is too long, I have to wrap up my introduction now and get into the rest of the essay. Kind of don't feel pressure to end your introduction or make your introduction shorter than it has to be. Your introduction has to do all of these things, so it necessarily has to be long. And a long introduction is perfectly fine because it sets you up for success going into the rest of the essay. So take your time on introductions, make sure your thesis statements and your introductions clear, they're doing all the things that they need to do. They will be long, and that's a good thing. You'll often find yourself writing, 1.5 pages on the introduction, which is perfectly fine as well. Okay, let's keep moving through. Guys, I think it's updating on your screen. Okay. Okay, there we go. So let's talk about the structure of introductions. I think this is very, very simple. So I want you guys to think of your introduction essentially in kind of 2 parts, right? So the first part of your introduction is basically the thesis statement. The thesis statement has to do things like incorporate context, bring in the rubric terms like we just discussed, break down and answer the questions. That's part 1. I will kind of get into more specifics later. Part 2 of your introduction is basically 3 summary sentences. So basically that's where you tell the marker, these are what my 3 body paragraphs are going to be. And they're going to be very similar to your topic sentences. So in fact, I want you guys to sort of derive your topic sentences from these 3 summary sentences. And you'll find sort of, there is some repetition and there is some overlap as you go through your essay. That's completely fine. You're allowed to repeat stuff as you go on. Okay. Okay, thesis statements. So this is part 1 of your introduction. So first half of your introduction. Thesis statement has to do a number of things. Firstly, obviously answers the question. Secondly, it introduces and takes on the key terms from the question. After it takes these key terms on, it has to break down the question. And finally, and most importantly, actually, also has to introduce context and authorial intent and make an argument. So we're going to go through how we do approach all of these. Okay, breaking down the question. So kind of first step of breaking down the question is we have to identify the key terms of the question first. And these are usually, verbs and experiences. And I think these are relatively intuitive for us to come up with and to go through. So why don't you guys have a quick look at this question and let me know which key terms you think, what the key terms of the question are. So analyze the way Orwell's 1984 challenges our assumption about human behaviors and emotions. I know not all of you guys will have studied 1984, but I think exercise is still applicable, just in terms of, developing your understanding of how to break these down. So what are the key terms of this question? Yep, so challenges are assumptions. Yep, definitely one. Are there any more key terms? Okay, great. Yeah, I think Tim hits all of them perfectly. So I think there's really three: challenges, assumptions, and human behaviors and emotions. Analyze is a key term, but we'll get into sort of the directive words like analyze or to what extent or discuss later. I think it's less important for us to deal with that part just now because essentially they ask the same thing, right? You can replace analyze with discuss or uh, whatever other word you want to do, and but functionally it's the same question. So it's not that key to break down kind of analyze, but it is really important for us to break down challenges, assumptions, human behaviors, and emotions. So that's great. Identifying that is great. So when we break down these questions, we have to sort of, delve into them, become more specific. So when we look at challenges, we have to explain, what that looks like, right? So how is he challenging this? When we look at assumptions, we have to explain what are those assumptions. When we look at human behaviors and emotions, we also have to explain and tell the reader what are those behaviors and emotions. So that's sort of a first step, identifying what things we have to break down. And I think the general test we like to ask ourselves what we need to break down is quite simple. And I think it's quite intuitive, right? So firstly, just ask yourself anything personal. So, things like assumptions, interpretations, ideas. I think a nice litmus test for this is just to say, uh, it's just like for anything personal, ask yourself, if I were to ask another classmate their ideas on this, would it be different, right? Are there multiple potential answers? So when you look at the previous question about human behaviors and emotions, are there multiple potential answers for what human behaviors and emotions Orwell is talking about? And if there is, then you'll have to be specific and break down that part. Secondly, on sort of is it broad or specific? I think questions will often be rather broad because they want to leave different students scope to explore different ideas. So if you look at our previous question, analyze the way Orwell's 1984 challenges our assumptions about human behaviors and emotions. You'll notice the term human behaviors and emotions is incredibly broad, right? And I think it's purposely ambiguous and broad because then it means you're able to break it down in your essay, allows you to zoom in on kind of what specific emotions and behaviors you actually want to talk about, which is really useful for us. And the key place where you want to break down these key terms is in the kind of very first sentence of your intro, so in the thesis statement. Okay, let's keep moving through. Let's look at how we actually break it down and the kind of mechanics of this. So we'll stick with our original question for now. Obviously not important for you guys to understand 1984, just to understand kind of how we actually do it. There's no sort of hard and fast rule for doing this. So obviously the framework I'm introducing now, for breaking down the question is very flexible. So be prepared if you have to do things kind of differently. So I think there's many ways to do it. I think two of the best ways are what I've flagged in the slide here. So the first way is you keyword, right? And you put the word of, and then you do added specificity. So in this case, we're taking the keyword of challenges and assumptions. I think you can kind of group challenges and assumptions kind of together because I think they operate in conjunction in this essay, in this question. So we say Orwell's 1984 challenges our assumptions. So we're using the keyword of assumptions here. We're inserting of, and then we're adding specificity. So of humanity's innate resilience and individuality. Really simple way of breaking down the keyword and adding more specificity here. Second thing we can do is keyword such as, and then specificity, which is what I used in the second part of this one. So human behaviors and emotions, keyword, and then we do such as, and then we do specificity where we zoom in. So human behaviors and emotions such as love, self-expression, and human connection. So once we break that down, I can kind of put them together, right? So building off what we had previous two sections, Orwell's 1984 challenges our assumptions of humanity's innate resilience and individuality by revealing that human behaviors and emotions such as love, self-expression, and human connection are inherently vulnerable and susceptible to authoritarian control. So, once we put that together, you'll see that this is already, I think, pretty solid thesis statement in an introductory sentence, simply because we've broken down the question. There's obviously more we have to do here to make it even better, but I think this is a solid beginning, right? Just breaking down the question sets us up very well, kind of moving forward and kind of, I guess, delving into the essay, delving into the introduction and making it really, really good. Finally, on kind of utilizing synonyms, for using synonyms, oftentimes kind of, I think this is more rare, so you'll have to use this less. But sometimes a question will ask you about kind of like a very specific experience. And in this case, you might find it tough to, spend 3 whole paragraphs talking about one single experience. So that's where, in your thesis statement, you'll replace that keyword with 3 synonyms, which you can use as the content of your body paragraphs. For example, if I get a question about, 1984 or, any text you want to say, Othello, 1984, and the question is about, human connection, it might be hard for me to just write 3 entire paragraphs on just human connection. That's when in my intro, I might replace human connection with synonyms such as love, friendship, and isolation. So I'll say, 1984 explores the theme of human connection through the lens of love, friendship, and isolation. And then I'll move on. So those 3 themes can become kind of what I examine in my 3 body paragraphs. So this is for, if the question's really specific, this kind of breaking it down and kind of replacing it with 3 synonyms allows you to zoom out a bit more. First part of this is when the question is broad, kind of allowing you to zoom in and be more specific. So kind of breaking down the question goes both ways. So if the question is really specific, you want to broaden it so you have more scope to answer. If the question is really, really broad, you want to kind of narrow it down so you're kind of more focused on specific sections that you guys want to talk about. Okay, let's keep moving through. So that's breaking down the question. So let's do an exercise and let's have a go at this one. I'll give you guys a few minutes to actually, let's start with the first step. So why don't you guys identify the key terms of this question? Okay, so compromise, pursuit of power, value, context. Yep, pursuit of power for sure. Yeah, I think I'd definitely say pursuit of power, value, and context are kind of the main 3 I focus on. Compromise is less so. I think it's more so like a directive term, right? So when we talk about the values, I think we'll naturally talk about what's compromised. So yeah, good job in identifying those 3. Next step now is a focus on breaking them down. So similar to how, we had challenges, assumptions, human behaviors, and emotions, how I broke it down into sort of this framework. Why don't you guys have a go at trying to use this framework of kind of zooming in, adding specificity for these 3 key terms. So pursuit of power, value, and context, going into that next step. Okay, does anybody have any thoughts on how we break this down in chat? Okay, so despite responding to unique Western endeavors, Conrad and Coppola's adaptation of a hero story reveals how an unmitigated pursuit of power compromises the value of moral integrity. Okay, I think you're sort of on the right track here. I don't think you've unpacked kind of the pursuit of power bit quite yet. I see you've kind of tried to unpack I think you're on the path of unpacking and breaking down the value bit where you talk about moral integrity, context bit, which is Western endeavors. So that's a good start. Okay, we'll keep moving through. So where can you guys see this? Okay, so we identified the key terms, which is pursuit of power, values, and context. So the next step is basically just zooming in and being more specific here, right? So pursuit of power, I think quite intuitive, don't need to overthink this. So pursuit of power over others is probably the way we break it down. We look at values, we'd say values using the framework we discussed earlier, values of humanity, morality, and dignity. And then we talk about context, we'll use the such as framework, right? So context such as colonization of the Congo and aftermath of the Vietnam War. So it's really simple, kind of how we break down and zoom in kind of on the question, right? And kind of when we put it together, put together kind of what we've broken down, we see a sort of, semi-workable introductory thesis sentence, right? So Conrad and Coppola tell a story about how the pursuit of power over others compromises our values of humanity, morality, and dignity in response to individual context of the colonization of the Congo, the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Obviously not a perfect intro, not a perfect introductory sentence yet, not even close, but I think we're on the right track here and it's a solid start. So that's the kind of way I want you guys to approach kind of start of essays when you're in planning time, thinking about it when you're just seeing a question. That's the kind of way I want you guys to start. Okay. I think this question is quite interesting, because I think we can do a lot more with this specific question when we're breaking it down. Um, I think we can unpack the idea and break down the idea of pursuit of power a bit more. We can pursue power over others, which is, I guess pursuing power externally. What else do you guys think we can pursue power over? And what else do, the protagonists, I guess the only protagonist in this play, what do the figures of, Marlowe and Willard, what do they also try and pursue power over? Yeah, great. I think internal conflict of the id and ego. I think, many different forms of internal conflict, right? Nice that you're kind of giving me the specificity here. Uh, Power to transcend laws, societal principles. I'd say that still fits in kind of the power of the external, right? Because laws, societal principles are more external forces. I think Jackie was more on the track of what I was looking for, which is they also try and look for power, pursue power of the internal, right? So the film and the book talk about power of the external. But they also talk about power of the internal, um, which is I think really important. So I think when we think about breaking down the question, kind of just looking at the pursuit of power term, and when we think deeper and we try and unpack it a bit more, we've realized they discuss both the pursuit of power of the external and also the pursuit of power of the internal, right? So whereas I think normally if you just saw the question and you didn't work on breaking it down and really thinking about zooming into it and being more specific, you'll probably just think about pursuing power of the external, right? Over people in the Congo, over societal, no, over the law, over those things. But if you work on breaking down the question, you'll realize actually there's another thing that they're trying to, pursue power over. That's where we can zoom in on. Okay. And I want to unpack that idea a bit more. So we had the original sort of, I guess, semi-workable thesis statement where we put together our breaking down. Now that we've broken down pursuit of power a bit more to not only the external, but also extending it to the internal, how do you guys think including that might change the rest of our thesis statement when we include sort of, pursuing power of the internal? How might this final sentence or argument need to be changed a little? Okay, so instead of power over others, it would be internal power or power within self, talking about a compromise of personal morality. Okay, I think you're on the right track here. Do you think Coppola and Conrad say sort of the attempt at trying to gain power over self? Do you think they say that compromises on kind of humanity, morality, and dignity, kind of borrowing but breaking down the terms? Or do you think they say sort of gaining power over the internal maybe restores our values of humanity, morality, and dignity? What do you think? What do you guys think? So does pursuing power of the internal compromise our values, or do they sort of restore the values that we care about in both these texts? That's how I read. Conrad and Coppola, influenced by their respective imperialist contexts, the Congo and Vietnam War, reveal that the inherent pursuit of power of others compromises humanity, morality, and dignity. However, they also assert the endeavor to reclaim power over one's internal avarice, maintain societal status, and act as a remedy to these moral tendencies. Right. That's exactly what I was looking for, right? I think when you break down the pursuit of power over the external and the internal, you'll notice that actually, these composers are providing a counterpoint, right? So power over the external is one that compromises our values of, humanity, morality, and dignity, or whatever values you guys want to break it down into, right? But I think power over the internal, so what these narrators are doing by telling their stories, thinking about the past, trying to kind of reclaim the past, reclaim and make sense of that narrative is actually a way that they actually reclaim and kind of act as your song said, act as a remedy to these moral temptations. So that's great. The way I put it in this one, I think you did it better than me. I just added I just said, where is it? Okay. Yeah, I just said, Conrad and Coppola tell a story about how the pursuit of power over others compromises our values of humanity, morality, and dignity, same as before. But the pursuit of power over the internal through self-reflection, introspection, may allow us to reclaim these values. and then same as before, in response to their individual context, colonization of the Congo, the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Obviously, once again, not a perfect introductory sentence quite yet, but I think we're on the right path here, right? And I think we actually, unpacking of the pursuit of power, thinking about it deeper, thinking about it kind of in a more specific way, we've actually now uncovered a whole new idea that we can use in our essay, right? That's a whole new paragraph's worth of content we can talk about. It allows us to extend our argument and make it much more interesting. So that's sort of why I think breaking down the question is so key, because it allows you to think about the question, think about the direction of your essay, many kind of more interesting, nuanced ways, which will allow you guys to get even higher marks. So as I mentioned before, I think solid opening sentence. What do you guys think we're missing though in this intro? Obviously, we're missing kind of a second half of intro, the 3 summary sentences, but within the actual first thesis statement, what do you guys think is missing? I'd say to give you guys a hint, I think there's 2 broad things we're missing in this sentence. Dates and title of each text. I think actually not super essential in this. Not super essential to mention the text, especially if it's a sort of internal school exam. They'll know exactly what text you're talking about. But include it if you guys want to. That's not what I was getting at. Didn't unpack how the story is told and what it shows. Great. I think that's what I was looking for. So basically, the way I'd say it is, first thing that's missing is the actual how part of the question, right? So remember, this question is a how question. So how do Conrad and Coppola tell a story? So we do need to mention kind of a bit of a technique, and that's where we talk about the narratological stuff, right? So quick, broad thing about how they do it. That's the first thing that's missing. Second thing is I think you also mentioned is what it shows, right? And what it shows is we're essentially missing an argument. We're missing purpose, right? Like, or if you read kind of what we have now, it's basically a recap of these stories. But at no point are we saying, this is what Conrad wants his audience to think and do. At no point do we tell the reader, the marker, this is what Coppola wants his audience to think and do and reflect upon and take action for, right? So we're missing those 2 things. We're missing the how part of a question, and we're missing the actual argument and the authorial purpose, which is the most important part. So we'll get into how we kind of get into and kind of accomplish those 2 things a bit later on. Before that, I wanted to jump back quickly to context, because I think that's a good launching point for when we discuss kind of arguments and authorial purpose. First thing I want to discuss, and I think I touched on this briefly in Othello last time, but for kind of people that are still coming and new today, is context is super important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it obviously just adds nuance and credibility to your arguments, right? So if you're making a claim that a composer is arguing something, that claim needs to be backed up by context. Otherwise, it's just you're making a claim, right? So there's nothing to substantiate that claim. Can you guys see the slides? Okay, yeah, you guys can. Okay. Second thing, and more importantly, is context dictates authorial purpose, right? So we mentioned last time how no text is born in a vacuum, right? So composers are always reacting to, reflecting, responding kind of to their context, right? So they don't just write because they want to write. They write because they either want to, encourage or affirm some beliefs in the context, or they want to challenge and destabilize some aspects of their context. So when we start with context, that very naturally allows us to segue into our argument, right? So when we start with, what a composer went through, that very naturally allows us to talk about their purpose. So I think always start with context when we're kind of building to our arguments. And I'd encourage sort of 2 pieces of context in the intro. So 1 piece of context in the first part, so the thesis statement, 1 piece of context in your summary sentences. So obviously you have 3 summary sentences. I think you only need context in 1 of those. So, whichever one fits best, I guess. It's really important though, when we're talking about context, to address kind of its many different layers. I think a lot of students kind of tend to do the first stop point. They tend to talk about the social, political, religious context, essentially kind of a broad societal context of the time, right? But a lot of students, I think, sort of ignore the second piece of context, which is the personal context, right? Which is what the actual composer has gone through. So for a lot of students that, the year 12 students that are doing 1984 at the moment, you guys will obviously talk about, the post-World War II context, the authoritarian context, those things. But I think it's also really important for you guys to talk about Orwell's personal context, right? So what was his experience fighting under the Spanish Civil War? How did that impact his text? What was his experience working under the British government? How did that impact 1984? Right? Similarly, for you guys that are doing, Shakespeare and Othello, obviously think about his broad Elizabethan Jacobean context, but also think about his personal context, right? So, thinking about the influence of patronage on him personally, think about kind of the many different eras he wrote his play in. We discussed last time how, Othello is part of that tragic era and how might that affect his depiction of Othello and his kind of adoption of tragedy in that form and all of that. So really important when we're dealing with context to talk about as many different layers. Don't just be sort of, one dimensional with it. Try and be nuanced and sophisticated. Kind of similar recap to what we had before. Where do I include context? Include it in the opening sentence of the intro, so thesis statement, in one of the summary sentences as well. Okay. Let's keep moving through. The way I think you guys want to integrate context is very, very simple. So kind of similar framework to before. You say something like, reflecting to or responding to, that's the first bit. Then you add your bit of contextual information, and then you move on to authorial purpose. And that's where you try and integrate keywords of question. So a quick example of this is, for example, for Coppola, you say, responding to the Vietnam War. Actually, I think I did not the best job of this here. When I talk about contextual info, probably be more specific, right? So don't just say responding to the Vietnam War. Point to maybe like a specific event in the Vietnam War. So like responding to the My Lai massacre in Vietnam War, I think is better. So responding to, point to your contextual information, and then point to your authorial purpose. So Coppola critiques whatever it is your argument you're making, right? And you'll see the reason kind of why I wanted to start with context, because it allows you to flow very neatly into authorial purpose, into what does Coppola, what does Conrad, what does Shakespeare, what does Orwell want to do. When we start with context, it very, very naturally flows in. Whereas like I think it's more clumsy if you start with purpose and then move back into context, because that takes two sentences, right? You'll say, Coppola critiques blah, blah, blah. He does this because he's responding to the Vietnam War. That's really clunky. You start with context, it allows you to do it in one sentence and to do it kind of really smoothly and really nicely. You can start with purpose, but I think, less compelling. But, as long as the context there, I think kind of can slide and this is okay. Okay. Now we started from context. The second thing I wanted to discuss was actually making an argument. And I think it's really important to clarify what an argument is, because it's really surprising how many students don't actually end up making an argument in their work, right? For example, if you look at the kind of thesis statements that we formulated before from breaking down the question, a lot of students would be really happy with that and say, that's a great thesis statement, but you'll realize it's not because it doesn't actually make an argument. So put simply, an argument is, what do you think the composer is trying to tell their audience, right? So, what do I think Shakespeare is trying to say? What do I think Orwell is trying to say? That's basically an argument. Every argument I make is, what they're trying to accomplish and what they're trying to make their readers do. And a good litmus test and kind of indicator of you making an argument is using opinionated verbs. Before we get into that discussion, let's start with sort of establishing what unopinionated verbs are. So these are verbs such as, shows, illustrates, illuminates. So when you find yourself saying Shakespeare shows or Shakespeare, illustrates, I think, you're probably kind of making less of a strong, kind of a less strong argument here, right? Because using a word like shows, illustrates, illuminates doesn't mean anything, doesn't provide the marker with any more detail, any more information. Every single writer that's ever written has shown, illustrated, and illuminates. That's not providing any more specificity. So when we're making arguments, we want to use opinionated verbs. We want to use verbs like critiques, supports, exposes, affirms, destabilizes, urges, cautions. All of these opinionated verbs that carry kind of meaning and feeling with them, instead of verbs such as show and illustrate. So that's a good test to see if you're making an argument, and we have to try and integrate those words into arguments when we're kind of making them. Okay, so let's look at this one. So let's quickly read this again. So Conrad Coppola tell a story about how the pursuit of power over others compromises our values of humanity, morality, and dignity. But the pursuit of power over the internal through self-reflection and introspection may allow us to reclaim these values in response to their individual context of the colonization of the Congo and the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Sounds good, but obviously, as we flagged before, this does not make an argument, right? So I'm using, tell a story about how the pursuit of power, what do I say? I don't use any sort of opinionated verbs. I'm not using verbs like critiques, supports, etc. Right? I'm using kind of the general bland verbs. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to think about how you might incorporate sort of the opinionated verbs into this bit. Don't worry about the how part just yet. We'll get into that later, but the actual making the argument part. So how might you rework this current thesis statement? into one that's making an actual argument. Okay. Coppola and Conrad critique their imperialist context of the Congo and the Vietnam War, warning that the pursuit of power over others can compromise one's humanity, morality, and dignity. However, they propose that self-reflection can act as an antidote to this moral malaise. Right. So you're using the critique instead of, in response to. So for the context part, which is great, you change you're adding in the warning here, so that's great. And then they propose that self-reflection can act as an antidote to this moral malady. Right, that's exactly sort of the way I'd approach it. So integrating those three keywords. The way I wrote it was also very simple. I just said, Conrad and Coppola tell stories that warn us about the pursuit of power, blah, 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 but advocate for the pursuit of power of the internal, critiquing their individual context of colonization of the Congo and that. Yeah, the only thing is about your one is I think you're kind of dropping the breakdown of the pursuit of power a little bit. So I think you're talking about the pursuit of power over others, but I think it would be good if you'd continue using that language in your second part, right? So instead of saying they propose that self-reflection can act as an antidote, saying, they propose that pursuing power over this internal through self-reflection can act as an antidote. So just remember to continue kind of breaking down the keywords here, right? Because remember that second part of the argument comes from breaking down the keyword. So, it's only kind of, you can only by breaking it down does the second part sort of make sense. So that's the only bit of feedback, but other than that, really happy with where we're going with that. So you'll see that kind of the transition from showing to actually making an argument is very, very simple change, but it's a really important change, right? That we all have to be really, really aware of and conscious of when doing our essays. Okay, so we're on the way here now. And the final thing that we need to do is obviously deal with the how, because this is a how question, right? And I think the way we deal with the how doesn't have to be in a lot of specificity, because you'll actually deal with it more in your actual body paragraphs. So the way I deal with the how in this one is really simple, right? So deconstructing the hero's journey archetype, then into our topic sentence. Don't actually have to explain how they do it in your thesis statement. That's something you'll save for later. So I think this is sort of the approach to building our thesis statements. Obviously, this took us quite a while, but as you guys practice, kind of grow more familiar with the process, it should kind of come together really naturally, and sooner will hopefully be second nature. So I think at the end of this is a pretty good thesis statement. It does all the things it needs to do that kind of we've discussed through here, right? So answers the question, it tells us the keywords of a question, breaks down the keywords of the question, integrates context, finally makes an argument about authorial purpose. That's great. Okay. Now, let's quickly talk about some different types of questions. Kind of discuss, analyze, evaluate, to what extent. These are sort of the main questions you'll get. Discuss, analyze, and evaluate all essentially mean the same thing, right? So usually they're framed in such a way that they, ask you to evaluate, analyze, or discuss how a composer explores a certain idea. So obviously, don't be fooled. It sounds as if it's just sort of a discuss question. So usually it'll be discuss how Conrad and Coppola do this. So it's framed as if it's sort of a techniques question, but obviously remember, even these questions, you have to make a judgment and you have to discuss authorial purpose too. To what extent are slightly different, but at its core is the same. It'll be to what extent does a composer make a certain argument or forward a certain idea. You still need to make a judgment just like you usually have to do, right? But importantly, I'm sure you guys all know, never say things like to a large extent or to a small extent. Like that should all be very implicit, especially when you run through your three summary sentences, right? So that's your time where you can make it clear, am I on the side of large extent or small extent by summarizing my three topic sentences? You'll probably always have a caveat. Rarely, I think, will you have three paragraphs where you're just like completely agreeing. So you'll probably have two paragraphs agreeing and then the final one kind of pushing back. So I think, you end up with a, to a mild extent sort of thing. Obviously, don't use that terminology. Different types of questions. Okay. Thesis statements. So kind of this quick recap of what we have to do with our thesis statements. So first half of the introduction, answers questions, introduces key terms, breaks down key terms, introduces context and authorial intent. Okay. Now, I want you guys now to have with everything we discussed, have a go at this thesis statement. Kind of so the opening sentence to this question. So this will be for the year 12s that are here. So give you guys a minute. Everything from here on will be more after this section will be a bit more year 11 specific. So, I know you guys haven't studied 1984 yet, but I think we can still sort of go through this examples because I think it's a nice example of sort of how we want to approach this, right? Um, so we start with context. So this answer adopts sort of reflecting, responding to structure of integrating context. So reflecting a contextual point, Orwell, then blah, blah, blah. So emerging from the political turmoil and atrocities of World War One, particularly the Holocaust. So we're adding sort of more contextual detail here, specific context which forced both Orwell and society to confront the fragility of human nature. Orwell challenges, that's when we're forwarding our argument, right? Challenges the assumption that individuals hold absolute control over the behaviors and emotions. So this is where we're breaking down the question a bit more. So assumption that individuals hold power and control over their behaviors cautioning his British audience of their susceptibility to authoritarian domination, urging for preservation, individual human behaviors and emotions such as love, authentic expression, and human connection. So you'll see here sort of, where this sentence is doing the things we flagged, right? So we're starting off with context, allowing us to integrate authorial intent. So you'll see the verbs in green. So challenges, cautioning, urging. We're repeating that over and over again. I think we're also zooming in on the assumptions. The assumption is that individuals hold control over behaviors. We're also zooming in on the human behaviors and emotions. We're giving examples of love, authentic expression, human connection. That's sort of what we want to do. So this is the first part of your kind of introduction, the opening sentence. Let's keep moving through. Now we move on to sort of the summary sentences. And this is basically part two of your introduction, and is essentially will serve as the topic sentences for each of your body paragraphs. And similar to the first sentence, we have to integrate keywords of a question and rubric terms. It's not as important for us now to break down the question in the summary sentence because ideally we've done it in the opening sentence already, right? So now we can just delve into the specifics and the nitty gritty of it in the summary sentence. As mentioned before, trying to include context in one out of the three sentences that we have going on. Okay, keep moving through. So, where's it go? Okay, so these were kind of examples of three summary sentences I put together for the oral question. We'll just run through it because nobody here does it. But you'll see that this is kind of the structure we're going to adopt. So similar to the opening sentence, start with context, so critiquing the totalitarian regimes, weaponization of political propaganda. Then from context, we very smoothly transition into authorial intent. So Orwell warns that the suppression of innate behaviors of self-expression can result in external control of individual emotions and actions. You'll see here that we're not really kind of unpacking kind of the key terms of assumptions and human behaviors because we don't need to, right? Because we've already unpacked what those key terms mean in the previous sentence. And you'll also see, for example, this is just building on from previously. So one of the human behaviors I think we established, which we broke down in the previous one, was like authentic expression. So we're sort of just building straight from that. So there's no need to say, the human behavior of authentic expression. We can kind of delve straight in. Second sentence, moreover, reflecting post-structuralist thinkers such as Foucault, he challenges, that's where we're forwarding our argument, the idea that we can ever accurately reflect reality. That's sort of responding to a question as well, right? So we're challenging an assumption. He warns us that language and its perversion can actually subconsciously shape human behaviors and emotions. So once again, the argument is that he's warning us about language, right? Final sentence, finally, through the pathetic arc of the novel, epitomized by Room 101, Orwell destroys the assumption that love and loyalty are impregnable, cautioning that individuals are infinitely malleable. So, once again, we're making a very clear argument there. You'll see sort of, only had to really include context in one of these sentences. I think one of them is more than enough. Final step is we put it all together. I won't bother reading it out. I'll give you guys like a minute, finish reading that. And once you're done, let me know. All right, hopefully you guys are done with this. We'll move on to something more applicable for you guys now. Okay, so here's a question. Despite its historical setting, Othello speaks to universal human emotions. Evaluate the statement through a close reading of the play. Okay, so I'll give you guys a few minutes to have a go at let's do the whole thing. So I'll give you guys a minute to try and do an entire intro. So part one, obviously the thesis statement, which we spent a lot of time on. Part two on the three summary sentences, which I hope is a bit more intuitive. So I'll give you guys, 5 minutes to work through that. All right, let's go through your songs one first. So Shakespeare's Elizabethan tragedy Othello reveals the universal human emotions of insecurity and desire to belong, something which is propagated by the contemporary conservative values of race and gender. However, Shakespeare seeks to criticize these societal narratives, asserting the internalization of these external prejudices inevitably results in the downfall of the individual. Okay. Um, is this the entire intro, or is this kind of part one of the intro? Okay, okay, that's what I thought. Um, let's okay. Let's. Why don't you finish the second half? Then we'll go through the entire intro. I think would be a bit more helpful. Okay, so second part. Through marginalization of Othello due to Elizabethan racism towards Moors, Shakespeare reveals that his internalization of these values manifests in transformation of his character to meet this expectation. Further, Othello's internalization of gender stereotypes ultimately results in the manipulation of Desdemona's public image, eliminating the dangers of internalizing and accepting social narratives. Okay, let's go through this entire intro. I think I can immediately see you implementing a lot of stuff we've discussed today, which is great. Few pieces of feedback though. I think the first half of this intro is better than summary sentences, but I think summary sentences probably like an easier fix. Let's quickly discuss the first part though. I'd like you to sort of when you're breaking down the universal human emotions, like whenever we're breaking down kind of experience, emotion, whatever it is, key term we're breaking down, very useful for us to break it down to three. The reason is kind of when we break it down to three, that gives us, kind of our three body paragraphs and whatever three ideas we're discussing, right? So, for example, when you're breaking down the universal human emotions, great that you talk about insecurity and the desire to belong. Uh, I don't. Let's think of a word like an emotion for belonging, like human emotion of yeah. We can stick with that for now. But I think it would be instructive and useful for you to add in another emotion there as well. Just that then allows you your three paragraphs can be talking about those three emotions. So that's the first kind of really quick thing. I like the integration of context. Perhaps I think you can kind of link the context of authorial purpose a bit more, right? So the idea that I think contemporary conservative values of race and gender, linking that a bit more to what Shakespeare is trying to do, which I think you're trying to do in the second sentence, but I think there's sort of a bit of a disconnect there. When you say Shakespeare seeks to criticize these societal narratives, are you talking about the narratives of like race and gender in Othello? Is that what you were getting at? Yeah. Okay. So in that case, I think making that clear and just linking it together, right? So the way I put it is something like, you know, um, I'd sort of just do it directly. So instead of having that second sentence where we're saying, however, Shakespeare seeks to criticize these social narratives, I'd insert it right at the beginning of when you integrate the context. So, for example, you'd say, Shakespeare's Elizabethan tragedy Othello reveals universal human emotions of blah blah blah. As he critiques the contemporary conservative values of race and gender. So putting that straight in instead of breaking that kind of context and purpose into two halves as well. I think would make it a lot clearer. Um, but I think the final bit is good, asserting that the internalization of these external prejudices inevitably results in downfall of the individual. And I think perhaps instead of asserting, changing it to a stronger verb, because I think asserting is kind of a very kind of non-opinionated verb, but asserting is similar to showing maybe something like warning or cautioning his audience that the internalization of these external prejudices results in a downfall of the individual. So I think that's to kind of fix the first half, but really solid intro already. On to the second half. I think the biggest thing about the second half is it's missing some sort of integration of authorial purpose, right? So let's look at, for example, the first summary sentence. Through the marginalization of Othello due to Elizabethan racism towards Moors, Shakespeare reveals that his internalization of these values manifests in the transformation of his character to meet these expectations. True, right? But none of that gives me insight into what is Shakespeare trying to accomplish here. And I get that you flagged that earlier in your intro, right? Like, you say Shakespeare criticizes these values, but you want to keep on repeating that as you move through your summary sentences, right? So the quick fix is, instead of Shakespeare reveals, Shakespeare, warns, Shakespeare, uh, you know, critiques that his internalization of these values, blah blah blah. That's the quick. I think that's a similar. I think a similar fix to the second summary sentence as well would work. I think would be useful to have three summary sentences because right now seems as if you might be doing a two body paragraph essay. Um, So I think if you break down universal human emotion into three things, then I think that gives you more space to do your summary sentences. Okay, we'll probably just go through the second one and then we'll keep moving through. Uh and yeah, like if you got yeah, okay. Let's read the second example. So in Othello, humankind's fickle emotions and desire to feel in control, with use of Iago to underscore Othello's jealousy, Shakespeare underscores the imperative for discernment when forming judgment of others with acumen and hesitance, foregrounding the tragic consequences of epistemological failure of the titular Othello. Othello's skewed understanding of the truth stems from his naive psyche, oblivious of the capacity of language to construct illusions of reality. Thus, I'll argue that Shakespeare accentuates the need for intellectual and moral perceptiveness. Yet the crux of the playwright's critique lies in his breakdown of the late Elizabethan, early Jacobean prejudices directed the racial engendered other, the universal human emotion of contempt. Shakespeare thus reveals the sorrowful, pathos-laden consequences of reductive, surface-level understanding of one another. Indeed, the play still completes modern society to interrogate one's own inherited assumptions and acknowledge the potential of internalized falsehoods destroy one's sense of self. Um, wait, so which one is this in chronological order or is it? Yeah, okay. Cut off the topic sentence. Okay, I think that's the whole thing. Um, okay, that's fine. I think there's a lot of kind of good stuff in here, but it needs to be a lot more structured, right? So start with the general, then zoom in. I think, for example, if this is if the first one, like in Othello, humankind's fickle emotions and desire to feel in control, if that's a sort of start, I think you're not doing kind of what needs to be done, right? Which is actually answer the question. So like, breaking down the human emotions. Yes, you talk about the desire to feel in control, which I guess is an emotion, but flagging everything you're going to talk about later as well, right? Um, and then also, I think making a stronger argument. In thesis statements, I think it's useful. So in the first half of our introductions, try not to sort of try not to mention characters or plot arcs. There's this test called like the door knock test, right? So can I, do your first sentence of your introduction? Can I say this to a guy that's never read Othello, never read Shakespeare? If I say it to them, and would they be like, okay, this sort of makes sense, right? So, if you start talking about characters and plots, guy that's never studied Shakespeare would have no idea. So try and keep it sort of more general. Uh, you know, try and keep it. For example, if I looked at Yisung's like one, I think it would pass the door knock test a little better, right? So it reveals the universal human emotions of insecurity and desire to belong, propagated by contemporary conservative values of race and gender. I think somebody that's never read Shakespeare that lives in like, the mountains in Italy or something could probably understand that, right? But if you start mentioning characters at the beginning, I think it undermines the making of an actual argument. So that's the quick thing. So I'd start with the general stuff before I zoom in a little bit. But I think the actual argument itself makes a lot of sense. I think your best stuff is sort of in the middle bit where you talk about the playwright's critique, license breakdown, blah, 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 of Jacobean prejudices directed to the racial and gendered other, the universal human motion of contempt. And then Shakespeare thus revealed, blah, blah, blah. So I'd probably start with that, right? So, Shakespeare examines a breakdown of universal human emotion of contempt, and then talk about, the desire to feel in control, all those other things before you end up zooming in. Uh, so that's my quick feedback for this. Yeah, okay. Tim, I think you sent one in the chat. We'll go through that at the end of the lecture if you want to, but I think for now, so you like if you want to stay back at the end, we can discuss that. But for now, we'll keep moving through. So kind of starting off from kind of the basic building blocks we discussed, keywords, I think very simple question. It's mainly just like I think the only real keyword we have to break down is universal human emotion, right? And then evaluate. The question was evaluate the statement through a close reading of the play. Evaluate is does the statement align with your reading? Similar to discuss, analyze. Not too much we have to do there. Uh, so this is what I had kind of going for it. So, indeed, despite its historical setting, Shakespeare's Othello reflects emerging Renaissance humanist values, speaking to the universal human emotions of love, jealousy, and insecurity, providing enduringly relevant messages to our contemporary audience. Critiquing overbearing Elizabethan norms espousing patriarchal and racist values is similar to what Yesung had. He warns that prejudicial social norms corrupt the individual identity by engendering universal emotions of insecurity and indecision. Similarly, Shakespeare warns that while the emotions of love may be empowering, it is equally fragile, alerting his and indeed our audience of approaching it with temperance and rationality. Finally, reflecting emerging understandings of human psychology, he cautions the capacity of jealousy to overwhelm and destroy individuals. So you'll see it. I don't like this intro is not flashy. It's not, doesn't use any big words, not particularly groundbreaking, right? I'm not coming up with like a revolutionary way of interpreting Othello or Shakespeare, but I think it does it strong, right? We start with the general thesis statement, which is kind of first part of this up till critiquing is the first sentence, right? And we're doing all the stuff we have to do. So we're integrating context, which is Renaissance humanist values, is reflecting these. We're breaking down the keywords of question. So universal human emotions, we're providing three examples of them. So love, jealousy, and insecurity, which end up becoming used as our three topics, three kind of body paragraphs, right? And then we move on to provides this enduringly relevant message. And then in our three summary sentences, each of them really importantly makes an argument, right? First sentence immediately starts off, we talked about with an opinionated verb, right? So critiquing this Elizabethan norm. And we're also continuing to integrate the keywords of human emotions, such as insecurity and indecision. Similarly, the second summary sentence also has to make an argument. So Shakespeare warns something. Once again, opinionated verb. Final sentence also has an opinionated verb, so he cautions the capacity of jealousy to overwhelm and destroy individuals. So that's sort of, what we're trying to aim for at the end of this. Nothing too fancy, nothing too flashy, but very solid, does its job, ticks all the boxes that we need to tick for an introduction. Okay, let's quickly cover topic sentences now. I think topic sentences are relatively intuitive and sort of, would be very similar to your summary sentences in the introduction. And you'll find they'll be actually quite repetitive, right? So, and it's actually pretty fine if it's repetitive, your topic sentences to your summary sentences, just reinforcing your argument again. And they're basically the mini thesis statements for each body paragraph. And importantly, I guess, highlight specific aspects and arguments within the broader thesis, right? So really simple stuff. A few important things to note about topic sentences and things that they have to use. Uh, Obviously, specificity in answering a question and incorporating the keywords of the question. For year 12's next year, integrating the rubric terms of a question. Most importantly, continuing to use context and authorial intent. So integrating the opinionated verbs we've talked about throughout the lecture today. That should still be in your topic sentences. Importantly, a topic sentence also has to flow. I think a lot of you guys, will prep obviously differently for exams, but some of you guys will have, you'll prep paragraphs which you'll use in your exams. One of the big dangers of this is that when you're in exams, your kind of essay will seem like just three paragraphs. It won't seem as a cohesive whole. So your topic sentences are your opportunity to make it flow, right? So, if you're talking about, your topic sentences need to build upon each other to create sustained sort of arguments, right? So link it to the previous argument. If you're talking about one theme, talking about a different theme, linking those themes together in a topic sentence rather than just sort of abruptly jumping, which I think is a danger a lot of people do. Similar to sort of the first sentence of your introductions, try not to mention plot or character unless it's specified in the question. Think about if your topic sentences can also pass the door knock test, similar to the first sentences of your introductions. Quick formula for how we do this, I think very simple. So similarly to kind of a way we approach first sentence in our introduction, we do responding to, reflecting to, critiquing, affirming whatever contextual point. Obviously try and be specific with this context point. Our composer, opinionated, strong verb, and then authorial purpose and argument. And this is where you sort of integrate the keywords of question. I think I have an example of this next slide. So yeah, so adopting this sort of, I guess, framework. So I had to go at doing the first body paragraph on the question we just discussed, and this first body paragraph was on love. So I started with reflecting medieval values of love as transactional rather than emotional. So that's the first step. So reflecting to, responding to, contextual point. The composer, Shakespeare, strong verb, warns that the universal human emotions of love, that's the authorial purpose now. So warns that the universal human emotion of love, while empowering, is equally fragile and vulnerable. So it's a very, very simple framework for how we do our topic sentences. We start with context, we move into kind of authorial purpose. Really, really simple here. Okay. I'll give you guys a few minutes now to have a go at doing the next two. You guys can, talk about whatever theme, human emotion you guys want to, but see if you guys can try and follow this framework and, come up with a few body paragraphs. Right. Someone asked, in this type of question, could you do a third however paragraph that explains how Iago's motiveless malignity is not really a universal emotion, that he possesses an innate desire to cause harm, don't have close, etc. support, if just but curious, but like, could you argue against the question in most cases, right? Yeah, for sure. I think you can definitely, because this is sort of the question is like, I think it was an evaluate question. You can definitely say, sometimes Othello does not speak to universal human emotions. I think raising the figure of Iago would be a great kind of counterpoint to this, right? So saying, figure like Iago is not this universal human, it's a very unique human through which Shakespeare uses to critique, Renaissance humanism. So yeah, I think definitely that would be a great however paragraph. Yes, really good thought there. Okay. Let's go through Tim's body topic sentence. Reflecting on the Elizabethan fabric of white hegemony, Shakespeare condemns the superficiality of racial stereotypes as looks are inherently deceiving to one's inner character. Yeah, great. I think nice integration of context, moving on very smoothly to the purpose. But yeah, as you identified, you're missing the sort of emotion part. So try and kind of answer the entire question there. Viewed through the lens of Elizabethan racism, Shakespeare criticizes the human emotion of insecurity, proposing that allowing external values to impact one's sense of self is conducive to a fractured and easily manipulated character. Great. I think, once again, great argument here. Although I think I'd encourage you to also think about your argument a bit more clearly. I would sort of, I'm being a bit critical here, but I'm not too sure. I think that Shakespeare's criticizing the emotion of insecurity. I think he's probably criticizing kind of societal norms and narratives that create insecurity, right? So I think, Shakespeare probably already, everybody probably already thinks insecurity is a bad thing. He's probably criticizing, the racial stereotypes that lead to insecurity. That's a slight change I'd make, but other than that, I think really great, on the right track here. Happy with that. Let's keep going then. So I came up with two more. So BP2, I said, and this is important to sort of link them, right? And the link doesn't have to be like actually a strong link, just has to like act as if you're linking them together. So it's sort of like a performative linking sentence. So while warning of the destructive capacity of love, Shakespeare, and we're following the same framework now again. So Shakespeare reflects medieval Christian virtues and similarly warns his audience against the universal human emotion of jealousy, as it is all-consuming and self-compounding. BP3, similarly, we're linking, while he reflects the Christian virtues of his context regarding the emotions of jealousy and love, he critiques its rigid racial norms, advocating for more social understanding by revealing the destructive impact racism has on the individual psyche. So once again, we're kind of making an argument there. I think I could have probably done a better job in the third one of it, talking about the actual human emotion, right? So I think that'd be in the last bit. So revealing the destructive impact racism has on the individual psyche, eliciting emotions of, you know, inadequacy, etc. So I'd probably do that. But you'll see that sort of, framework for our topic sentence is really simple, and we sort of plunge into arguments from there. Okay. That actually brings us to the end of today's lecture. Hope you guys all found it interesting and interesting and useful. As mentioned before, this is part one. So part two I'll be recording part two in future days. And if you guys sign up for Summit next term, you'll have access to part two. Give me a second and I'll actually upload the slides to anybody who wants them. And then I'll stay back and answer a few more questions. Okay. What is your opinion on two topic sentences? Perfectly fine. Sometimes sometimes the question will have a lot of moving parts. For example, this Othello one's quite simple. Next year, especially, you'll have questions that are more complex. You'll have more things to deal with. So splitting your topic sentence into two to avoid a super long one is fine. Couldn't attend the first half, so I was just wondering if you could recap some of the tips on essay structures, argumentation, documents. Yeah, okay, I'll save that for the end quickly. What is your opinion on having a thesis at the end of the intro I'd avoid it. I think you want to start really strong and have your thesis right at the very beginning. So your marker knows like this is exactly what you're arguing. This is your stance. So always have it at the beginning. Um, I know sometimes it's sort of hard because like as you're writing, you're building and it becomes better, but you kind of really want to start your thesis at the beginning before you get into everything else. How would you structure an essay with three texts? So yeah, I think the way I'd structure an essay with three texts, and this is applicable to people that are thinking about doing extension one next year, is you do the way I'd suggest is you do a six paragraph structure, which sounds crazy, but I think is the best way to do it. Similar to a two text, so you two themes, and then text one on theme one, text two on theme one, text three on theme one, and then keep moving through. So six paragraphs for three texts is I'd say the best way to go with it. Obviously, it will be shorter paragraphs. How might you be able to do a good topic sentence intro that is succinct yet covers enough details when comparing two texts? Are there ways to simply so how might you be able to do a good topic sentence intro succinct yet covers enough details? Two texts. Are there ways to simply connect sentences and ideas? Yeah, I think sort of the way we want to approach topic sentences when there's two texts is very similar to when we have one text, but just kind of doing it again, right? So you'll have a much longer intro for two texts. I think the way you should think about it is sort of the similarities and the contrast. So, for example, the way you do one text, you might say, let's use Coppola and Conrad. That Conrad critiques Western colonialism, blah blah blah. The way you integrate Coppola is you just add a sentence after, right? So similarly, Coppola, reframes this discussion to whatever context he's in, critiquing a whole different thing. So you just kind of adopt a similar structure, but just adding kind of a few more sentences of authorial purpose in. I think when they're kind of similar, I think it's you can just kind of just put them together, right? So you can say both Conrad and Coppola also explore blah blah blah. So you can kind of put those together, similar to the way you kind of do one text. Um, when we're including context purpose, the way I do it is you start with one composer's context and purpose, then you'd say this composer has a different context, therefore his purpose is different. So that's the way I do it. Narratology stuff, I think in the intro doesn't have to be super specific. You probably just name drop it like one time. You can say both composers adopt this narratological structure or they deconstruct this narratological structure. I don't think you have to be super specific. Okay. Send the Othello lecture notes for Wednesday because you couldn't send them in China. Yeah, sent them, I think, a couple hours ago to the emails to the ones that you guys um popped in the chat last time, so it should be there. Okay. Um, yeah, does anybody have any other questions about today or about Summit and what we'll be doing like next term, etc.? Hive doctors notes resources. I'll have a look, and I think we might do a few videos on Instagram quickly recapping some ideas, but at the moment, not really, and we don't have like a masterclass of that coming up. Sorry about that, but I tried to integrate some of the Heart of Darkness stuff in examples today, so hopefully that was still semi-useful for that. Yeah, sure, I can send it to your email again. How would you go about doing a six paragraph structure on extension? Um, I mean, similar to sort of as I mentioned earlier, the two text one. So you identify your two themes, then basically, what does the first text say about first theme? What does the second text say about this theme? What does the third text say? Um, and then identify theme two, and then you do what each text says as well. Nothing to, don't overthink it, just do very similar. The only thing is you probably have to you probably have to place more of an emphasis on context and purpose when you're doing a six paragraph structure. Because really differentiating, how is each text different and why they're different is really important. Probably easier for a two text one. Um, how long should an essay be in general? Yeah, I think Alex is right. There's no sort of exact essay thing. As long as like how long should an introduction be? As we talked today, it can be however long it needs to be, right? So as long as you're hitting the points you want to do, I think that's enough. 1.2K words though is definitely enough, so don't be worried about that. Um, Othello notes. Yeah, sure. Said those. Okay. Any more questions for today? All right. If not, oh yeah, quickly. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot about yeah, I drew yeah. So couldn't attend first half of today's lecture, so wondering if we could recap some of the tips on essay structure and argumentation for Heart of Darkness Apocalypse Now. Let's run through the slides quickly. Um, we just quickly discussed sort of like structures for one text and two texts. One text, very, very simple, as you guys all know, introduction, three body paragraphs, conclusion. Two texts, I thought, like my suggestion is, I think four paragraphs is sort of the best way of doing it. And you structure it based on two themes, and then you have two paragraphs per theme, comparing what each text says about it. The caveat I did discuss for Heart of Darkness, though, as I think a three paragraph structure can work as well. The reason I'd say that is Coppola and Conrad do a lot of the same things, right? So they examine themes of power, corruption, humanity's darkness, and they arrive at quite similar conclusions, albeit kind of through different avenues. So in that case, instead of four paragraphs, you can do sort of paragraph one and two on kind of what they do differently, and then paragraph three might be on what they do the same and what's universal between them. So that's one way you can approach it as well. But in terms of structure, as mentioned before, like there's no sort of one size, one rule fits all structure. It all depends on the question, all depends on what text you're studying. So, but two texts generally, especially going into year 12, I'd suggest four paragraph structure. Um, would it be fine to do three paragraphs and Conrad and Coppola comparison in each one? I think it would be fine, although like I think you might find it difficult to sort of really delve because I think if you're doing three paragraphs and each paragraph has both Conrad Coppola, you're dealing with three themes, which is quite a lot, and you're not allowing yourself in each paragraph to really delve into each text and what they say about each theme. Whereas if you do maybe three paragraphs, Conrad, Coppola, then combine on what they do the same. That allows you to kind of delve into each theme a bit deeper. Obviously, it's fine, but will depend on the question and how well you write as well, I guess. Um, how do we ensure by using four paragraphs we can still? My AirPods ran out of battery. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah, okay. Um, How do we ensure that by using four paragraphs, we can still really answer the question, make more side-by-side comparisons, like any tips, etc., to add in topic sentences, or should evidence major quotes relate to one another? Yeah, great question. So for four paragraphs, it's really important in topic sentences of BP of both of each BP1. Your topic sentences to kind of encapsulate both body paragraphs. So, let's say you're doing Heart of Darkness Apocalypse Now. Your first theme is like colonialism or something, right? So like your theme is your first theme is colonialism. Your topic sentence for body paragraph one shouldn't just talk about Conrad, should also mention Coppola. So you should say something like, Conrad, this is really rough. Conrad critiques colonialist narratives, whereas Coppola adapts this narrative to to the 20th century. So your topic sentence should try and encapsulate both texts when you're using a four paragraph structure. However, when you're onto BP2, which is a Coppola paragraph, you can just sort of plunge into Coppola. You can just say, Coppola adapts Conrad's narrative to blah blah blah. Yeah, so really important to make sure you're making really clear the kind of similarities and contrast between them, and would be useful yeah, in terms of textual evidence, for example, in your Conrad paragraph, probably more so in your Coppola paragraph, maybe have a quote from Conrad, which you can directly kind of contrast to what Coppola is doing. So yeah, so feel free to sort of mix and match quotes, right? So in your Coppola paragraph, have a Conrad quote to show contrast. In the Conrad paragraph, have a Coppola quote to show contrast. I think that's a really nice way of, as you say, making kind of more side by side comparisons. Yeah. But this is all stuff we're gonna like stuff that's less important for you guys now, but stuff we're all gonna get into next year when you guys start year 12. So we'll, really delve into how we do that as well. Okay. Yeah, any final questions? Another question. Would you base your structure off of themes or narratological structures like Campbell's departure, initiation, and return? I definitely do it off themes. I think themes is it's much more intuitive and easy way to go. Obviously, talk about the narratology stuff. So, explaining how they've deconstructed or utilized different structures and why they've done that. But I'd stick with themes for sure. How did you go about essay writing when memorizing essays that affect your ability to adapt topic sentences, going for less paragraphs, do less adapting? I think everybody has their own sort of approach to it. I think the reason why I really wanted to focus on introductions with you guys today is, you know, like you should never pre-write your introduction. Like you can pre-write your body paragraphs, and obviously you'll have to adapt them in sort of in the exam, but your sort of your introduction should always be sort of come up with it on the spot in exam in planning time. So that allows you to really answer the question. And as we discussed earlier, sort of, the markers judge you off your introduction. So as long as your introduction is really packaged to answer the question really well, you can get away with, your memorized, pre-prepared body paragraphs being a bit less tailored to the question, just because your introduction, breaks it down and analyzes it so well. Um, yeah, so I don't think it really affected my ability to adapt topic sentences. I think topic sentences also you should try and keep rather flexible. But you can memorize stuff like analysis, quotes, the general arguments you want to make. Yeah. Which staff goal do you go for? Theme one, hypocrisy and violence from imperialism. Theme two, darkness and human psyche. Theme two, possibility and human redemption. Theme one means all powerful. Yeah. Um, I think they're both good. I think it all depends on the question, right? Like we covered a question, which was get it for you. We covered the question of how do Conrad and Coppola tell a story about how the pursuit of power compromises what we should value in response to their context. I think maybe in that one you might do the second one, right? Like um you might spend two paragraphs on darkness within the human psyche that emerges from the pursuit of power of the external, but then you might have theme two on the possibility of human redemption when we try and pursue power of the internal. Right, so I think both of them are really good ideas. You should have them prepped, but all depends on questions. I think the first bit, like theme one, hypocrisy and violence, theme two, darkness, is probably more flexible and can be used in more questions. But I think in terms of how good each argument is, I think broadly similar, and I think we're both great. Yeah. Okay. Do you have any tips to cut down on selecting what evidence to use for each paragraph? Too many, pretty good to talk about. I think whichever see if you can keep the quotes that have most like have kind of the most techniques in them. Try and pick quotes that kind of have multiple techniques, right? That have a metaphor and also utilize like a symbol and a motif, right? So any quotes that have multiple techniques which you can use to analyze. Um but yeah, I think it's all dependent on the actual question, right? Some quotes you'll find are less kind of fit a question less, and some quotes might fit a question more. So I think it's like just a matter of judgment. There's no kind of good or bad quotes, right? As long as the quote itself isn't important. What's important is how you're analyzing it and advancing your argument, right? So, um, I think quotes are pretty replaceable. Like you can sort of, do whatever you want with quotes as long as the analysis and explanation is there. It doesn't matter too much. For a question like discuss how texts reframe ideas across contexts, the malleability and universality of human experiences, would you write the whole essay on the power and control of the external internal, two comparative power, another two paragraphs on another theme, like truth and meaning? Um, okay, let's say discuss how texts reframe ideas across context, malleability and universality. Um, I would probably focus my whole essay on power and control over the external and internal, because I think number one, that's more than enough to write an entire essay on. And I think the reason I do that is I think it shows a bit more kind of sophisticated thinking. Where remark is like, oh, he's really breaking down the question and thinking about the external and the internal, and he's really delving into that. I think, you know, um, Yeah, I think I'd probably stick with that. Although the second theme also sounds fine, right? But the only thing is, like, if you have one paragraph on the external and one paragraph on the internal, you'll have to deal with two texts in each paragraph, right? So that gives you less space to really focus on each of the texts, which I think is really important in terms of analysis. Um, if you're going to do four paragraphs, 12 analysis is going to be hard in 40 minutes. Where would you cut analysis down? E.g., two scenes and one apocalypse now paragraph. Um, so yeah, three ETAs, 12 analysis, 3 minutes. Yeah, I think two scenes in each one is enough. As I said before, I think sort of and also, I think a nice thing you can do for things like Apocalypse Now, you can point to like multiple scenes in one similar analysis, right? Like, for example, the way he kind of fragments a narrative and he cuts between, time and he has jumps like that. That's a technique which you can use for multiple scenes, right? So you can, sort of talk about multiple scenes but analyze it in one go, which I think is useful for this movie in particular. But yeah, I think, if time is a struggle, then maybe having two quotes, but spending more time on actually sort of explaining authorial purpose and making those points is important. Yeah, I think don't have you can't have one quote a paragraph, but two a paragraph is definitely it's definitely okay as long as you're doing all the other stuff correctly. Okay. Um, quickly brush over the opinionated verbs, ideas, and its significance. Yeah. So the reason I want you guys to use opinionated verbs is um because that allows you to actually make an argument. Like a lot of times people say Shakespeare shows or Shakespeare illustrates. That's not giving the marker anything or pointing to purpose, right? Because obviously Shakespeare will show, Othello or show narratives of racism. That's not an argument. Opinionated verbs are verbs like critiques, cautions, exposes, supports, affirms. So when you say, you'll see, for example, if I say Shakespeare shows racial narratives that affect Othello versus Shakespeare critiques racial narratives that affect Othello, when we replace it with critiques, we're immediately now making an argument about what Shakespeare's trying to do with his audience and purpose, and that's what we're looking for. So, uh, yeah, whenever you have something like shows, see if you can replace it with a more opinionated verb. So that's why I think it's really important. Okay. All right. If there's no further questions, I'll wrap it up here. Thanks, guys, for coming to three master classes. Hopefully you guys have taken something away, and hopefully we'll see you guys next term at Summit. Thank you. I'll end the lecture now.